was really with the creation of the Linux kernel and then the open sourcing of Netscape Navigator in around 98 that this term open source was invented. And it was really invented because this term free software was often seen as being overtly political, very much this ideology that all software should be free, and it was seen as anti-commercial. So the idea of this open source rebrand, if you like, was to make things more acceptable for companies like Netscape who decided they were better off to make the browser open source. Now that's weird, it's all echoing now, than it was to spend the time and effort keeping that source code restricted. Now a lot of this history, although albeit only going up to about 2000, is documented in these various essays that Eric Raymond wrote, including most famously The Cathedral and the Bazaar. And what he's talking about there is the difference between the top-down development model that's typical of commercial software, where there's really someone in charge and telling everyone what to do in kind of a tree structure, versus the somewhat chaotic model that was used for developing the Linux kernel. And he's also contrasting the fact that Linux somehow managed to come out with this working operating system in a fairly short period of time, whereas the Free Software Foundation had been trying to create an operating system based on the herd kernel for a decade and really not got anywhere. There's a bunch of other interesting essays in here, some talking about, further the history of open source and how they started this foundation, but it only goes so far. It only goes up to about 2000, and things have changed significantly since then, especially with the advent of sites like GitHub and how that's affected open source development. Now, if we go back to sort of the turn of the century, 20 years ago now, yeah, 20 years ago, Microsoft was one of the companies that really feared the idea of open source software, and they spread a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, even going as far as describing open source software as a cancer. Now, this was their public image. Privately, they were writing these internal Halloween memos, as they've been dubbed, outlining all the ways they feared that open source would basically destroy their business model. And their initial approach was to try and attack it and destroy it that way. And when that didn't work, they seemed to have realized that actually things work better if they can work alongside the open source community, to the point that we now have slides like this from Microsoft conferences saying how much they love Linux, and the fact that you have Windows subsystem for Linux that you can easily download. Now, for me personally, I've had this journey with open source for quite a long time in my career. And it really started going back to around 99. I was working in a project where it was a batch system, it ran overnight. I checked if everything was successful in the morning. If it was, I was done by about 9 a.m. And then I had the rest of the day to fill somehow, unless something came up. But the next set of jobs didn't run until the evening. So what I did is I spent time learning new technologies, or what were new to me at the time. And one of the things was HTML and CSS, web development. And as I went through this, I started reading a series of articles on cascading style sheets. And one of the things that stood out about that was they were talking about these CSS specifications and how neither of the big browsers at the time actually implemented most of these specifications. So these are the days of probably Internet Explorer 5 and Netscape Navigator 4, and they both did a terrible job of implementing the CSS specifications, both CSS1 and CSS2. And what these articles talked about that I was going through was how Netscape had open sourced Netscape Navigator, and they were building this new rendering engine called Gecko that had this aim of being compliant with standards. And that was kind of interesting to see. So later I moved to a new job because clearly spending 7 hours of the day doing basically nothing wasn't particularly fulfilling. And I started using this Mozilla browser that was using this Gecko rendering engine as my daily driver. And what I'd do is every day I'd download a zip file of the latest nightly build. I'd keep the previous day that worked just to make sure, and then unzip it and use that as my daily driver for both a browser and an email client, and they also, these were the days when everything was a suite of different tools together. And it looked very much like this screenshot here, this very strange kind of flat user interface. Now, around the same time, I started to make use of more tools that were open source as part of my job. So we were developing in Java, and we were using the Apache Ant build tool. So I became aware of that, but we found we were using a version control system called PVCS that's really not much of a thing anymore, but although Ant had some support for it, it was kind of limited, and we wanted to do other things as part of our builds. So my first contribution to open source was to increase the integration between Ant and PVCS. And back in the day, if you wanted to submit a change, you were pretty much dealing with mailing lists. So I zipped up my Java files, posted it to the mailing list, and never got a response. So while that open source contribution wasn't actually accepted into Apache Ant, which was a little disappointing, over the years I did actually get people emailing me, because obviously I'd used my email address to post it to that mailing list, saying like how much they found that useful and they were using that in their organization, and obviously we continued to use it locally. And as my career's gone on, I've continued to make contributions to a range of open source projects. And it's typically been based upon having a need in my work, but they've ranged from, Java projects, JavaScript, all kinds of different things. And another part of that is, bug reports and saying like, yeah, this is a problem, can someone fix it? Because while I'd like to fix bugs that I find in open source projects, I don't always have the skills or the knowledge or the time to do that. Now, I've gone as far as to create my own open source project called Stack Manager that I'll talk about a little later. And then, finally, it's doing things like this, standing up here and talking about open source and how I think it's important. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the different ways you can contribute to open source projects. And this, in many ways, mirrors what I described as my personal journey. The first thing I'd like to talk about is using open source in a conscious way. What I mean by this is it's very easy to go online and say, well, find me a package that does some particular thing. So perhaps I'm writing something in Node, and I want to left pad a string. I use that particular example for those of you who remember the whole left pad fiasco. But it's very easy to find that in NPM, JS, and whatever the site is. And say, well, here's the name of it, here's the version, include it in package.json, use it in my code, and I'm done. And that's all I think about it. But that's not using it consciously. You've made use of it, but you've not really thought about the consequences of incorporating that code into your application. So I would advise, if you're going to pull in a different library like that, or use it as the core of your product, to research it a bit more. If it's on GitHub or whatever the project site is, look and see whether it's being actively developed. When was their last release? How many open issues are there? Are there a bunch of pull requests or merge requests stacked up that no one's bothering to look at or merge? And those are all kind of warning signs that if you're basing your application upon this library, you could run into problems later, because if you need a fix, you're probably not going to get it. Even if you contributed it back yourself, it wouldn't get merged and incorporated. But the other aspect of this is just to think, someone spent their time to develop this open source library for me. Be grateful that they spent time doing that. And some of them may have been paid to do this. It may have been part of their job, but some of them just contributed their own time to put all this effort in, and it's made your life easier as a developer. Now, if you like an open source project, talk about it, blog about it, present about it. A bunch of the presentations here are about tools that are under an open source license that people have found useful. Because the reality is, an open source project is really only as good as its community and its users. It doesn't matter if you make something open source if no one's using it. Really, it's not of any significance. No one's benefiting from it. Now, if you do find that you've got a particular issue with something, it's always good to, don't suffer in silence. Go and look at the site for that open source project and see if someone else has reported that issue. If they have, then it's a good idea to indicate that you also have that problem, because the developers will often prioritize based upon the most number of people affected by a particular issue. They won't always. Sometimes they'll just pick whatever's important to them, but it's certainly a factor. What you don't want to do, at least on GitHub issues, is write a comment and put +1, because everyone who's watching that issue will get an email that just says +1, and it's not super useful. It will annoy the maintainers of that project, and it may actually discourage them from fixing it. I don't know that people are quite that perverse, but I might be. What is the recommended practice, at least on GitHub, is to add a thumbs up emoji on the original sort of root issue on the description. And in fact, in this example, it's someone putting an issue on GitHub itself, suggesting that if someone tries to put in a +1 comment, that they automatically turn it into a thumbs up emoji. And then I'm being a little unfair to this guy who wrote the +1, because I think he was trying to be funny on that same issue. Now let's say no one's reported the issue. So this is the time when you want to submit that bug report yourself. Now, in submitting a bug report, it's not just a fire it off and hope for the best type of thing. There's a certain responsibility on you to include as much useful information so that the developers or maintainers of this project can actually recreate the problem and see if they can fix it. Because if you just give a very brief description and don't provide any details, the chances of them actually looking into it and fixing it are pretty minimal. This may not actually be a very good example, despite the fact that it was one I wrote, but it was a fairly simple thing. But some projects will have a template when you submit an issue, and they'll ask for all this different information, but not everyone's set that up. But it's a good idea to include details of, if you're using a particular language, which version of the language, which operating system, other libraries, et cetera, and if possible, to include an example of, how to recreate the problem so the developer can just pull that down and see, oh yeah, it fails for me too. And then you can rule out things like environmental issues and say, well, it's actually my code and not your environment. Now, perhaps you don't provide enough information, and the developer reaches out to you and says, well, I need more details. It's your responsibility as the submitter of this bug to get back to them and provide that details and do it in a timely manner, because you've caught their attention. They're paying attention to this bug report, which means there's a good chance they'll do something about it. But if you ignore that and wait a week before you provide any information, they may have gone off to something else. So if you do get that interaction, follow up on it as soon as you can. Now, in an ideal world, and you'll often hear people say, oh, it's open source, just fix it yourself. And in an ideal world, you'd do that. You would actually contribute a fix yourself. It's not always possible. Certainly I've come across bugs where I look at the code and it's like, well, I've no idea what's going on here. There's no way I can possibly fix it, or I simply don't have the time. So I'll report an issue, but I won't really go beyond that, and I'll just hope that it gets fixed. But other times, just by going through the effort of finding out what the bug is, or learning enough about the tool that I know what enhancement I want, I've actually figured out 90% of the problem anyway, and so I might as well spend the time to try and fix it myself and contribute that fix back or that enhancement to the project. So here's an example with the LSQL, I think that's how they say it, library for Java, that I found like, well, I really want to be able to do this, but it doesn't support this, it does something similar. Let's see if I can add that as a change. And in this case, I had a sort of discussion with the original developer, and we sort of figured out how best it should work, and he accepted the contribution. It was included in the next version of the library, and that was all good, and then we could make use of that change. Now, I do want to make an aside here, because a lot of this has become much easier with the advent of distributed version control, and particularly Git, because that sort of dominates things, although Mercurial's certainly an option. So almost everyone is using this now, whereas 10, 20 years ago, people were primarily using tools like CVS and SVN, which didn't have this distributed model and made contributions much more difficult. So like I mentioned, that first contribution I tried to make to Ant, I had to zip up my files and post them to a mailing list, because there was no way that just some random person off the internet was going to get access to this shared CVS or Subversion server, which is the only way that you could contribute directly to a repository in the past. So many of you are going to be working in sort of corporate environments where you have this model that's shown on the left here, where you have some shared repository. You clone it down to your local developer workstation, you make some changes on a branch, you push up that branch, and then you create a merge request or a pull request between those two branches, but it's all within that same shared repository. So it's somewhat similar to that traditional SVN CVS model, except that you don't need to be connected to the original source server to make a branch, so you have a lot more flexibility in your working model, but there's somewhat of a centralization there. On the right-hand side, and this is pulled directly from the Git documentation, so I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek with it being labeled dictator, because this is basically the way the Linux kernel development works, and when they're talking about the dictator, they're talking about Linus, who manages and maintains the Linux kernel. But he doesn't do everything himself. He doesn't look at every patch. The way Linux is developed is there's a whole bunch of subsystems, and there are maintainers for those different subsystems, and they have their own Git repositories that are public available, and people contribute to them if they want to make a storage change or a networking change. They contribute to that, and then if that maintainer for that subsystem has accepted it, it will then get merged into the sort of root Linux kernel repository, basically without Linus checking everything on it, because he trusts those maintainers of those subsystems. And it's a much bigger model than this shows. Now, the reality is most open source projects aren't like that unless they're really big, but Git was designed by Linus and people working on the Linux kernel because they wanted to support this development model. So in a more typical model, for a small open source project, and let's say we're on GitHub, so a lot of projects are obviously on GitHub. You'll fork the original repository within GitHub under your account. So if we've got Leading Edge Stack Manager, we'll fork it to my personal account as Stack Manager. I'll clone it down locally. I'll make my changes there. I'll push up, and then I'll do a pull request between two repositories on Stack Manager. They can review the changes and see if they want to merge them or not. So they don't have to give me access to that original repository. They can do it with this sort of secondary repository. Now, if you want to contribute to open source, but you don't have a particular project in mind, a good way to get involved with that is one of these many hackathons that go on. I've put a few of those up there. But these are going on throughout the year, and you can look for the websites for different hackathons, and they'll list projects that are actively looking for contributions. And sometimes, like with the hackathon in the bottom right with the GitHub plus dev.to one, they sort of have people tag repositories in GitHub with hackathon or whatever so that you can easily find them. And then within those projects, they'll often put tags on individual issues to say help wanted or good for first timers to indicate this is a good one for someone to pick up if they've never worked on that project before. And they're also hopefully primed to be accepting submissions from random people who've not worked with them before because they're contributing, they're taking part in that hackathon. That being said, don't be the person who takes part in this, and because they're typically gamified and have leaderboards, don't be the person who opens 50 different PRs with a text change to the README file just to try and get up the leaderboard, because you're just ruining it for everyone. Sadly, there are a bunch of people who do that sort of thing. Now, if you've contributed to a project multiple times already, then they may ask you to become a regular contributor, and you may get right access to that, root repository that everything, is ultimately sourced from. Now, here's a picture of something other than GitHub, because we wanted some variety here. So this is GitLab, and one of the top projects there is the Inkscape drawing project. And we've got contributors here with hundreds or even over 1,000 commits. So these people are clearly working probably full-time on this. And it may be that they're paid to work on this project, even though it's an open source project, or they may just be really dedicated and devoting a large portion of their time to it. I don't know. It certainly can be a huge time sink if you're not doing this for your job. So if you intend to become a contributor, think about that. Do I really want to spend my evenings and my weekends working on something outside of my regular day job? Work-life balance is important. Now, finally, you may decide, hey, I want to create a new project. It's not something to entirely be taken lightly, as I'll talk about in a second, but it's what I did. I created something called Stack Manager. It's basically a wrapper around the CloudFormation, AWS CloudFormation commands to create and update and delete CloudFormation stacks. It's really just the fact that I was annoyed that when you use the command line to do these things, you have 10 different arguments that you have to supply, and one of them could be a JSON file. And if you've got lots of different environments, you have a collection of JSON files for those. And it's just a pain to manage and put into CI/CD pipelines. And I'd used tools like this at one company, and then at another company, I saw the need for something similar, and I implemented something there. But the reality was, I'd written it for them. I didn't own that code. I couldn't take that code with me. So what happened in this case is I went to another client, saw the need for something similar that would work in the CI/CD pipeline. I actually looked around for existing projects that did things similar to this. I found one, I tried it out, didn't really like it a lot. So in the end, I decided, well, I'm going to write this myself. I talked to my manager at Leading Edge and said, can I use some of my Leading Edge training time to work on this rather than using client time? And can we make it open source? And they agreed to that. So this is available under an open source license, and anyone can use it. Now, has it set the world on fire? No. But we are using it at a couple of different clients and for internal projects. And for that, I count it as a small success. If you are going to create an open source project, you should be considering some of those things. Like, is it really any different than what else other people have developed? And perhaps in this case, I felt it was different enough. Others may have made a different decision. But then, am I going to maintain this project? I try and maintain Stack Manager. I don't do a brilliant job. I'm not currently on a project where I'm using it, so that makes it a little harder, and that's a problem for a lot of people. They write something, they make it open source, and then they no longer need it themselves, and so they don't maintain it. If you're not going to maintain it, though, and you've got a user base, if people have actually started using it, you need to think about how other people can contribute back to it. Also, a sort of idea of succession. If you're not maintaining it anymore, can anyone else maintain it for you? Can you pass it off, hand it off to someone else who's going to look after it better than you can? Now, if you are going to work on open source software, you unfortunately need to understand licenses a bit. I put the disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. I'm not going to give you any legal advice here. So I would say if these become issues, then you need to talk to people at your company, especially if it's resolved around your work, who can make those decisions, and so you don't get into hot water yourself. But firstly, what makes something an open source license? And this is actually surprisingly important because there are a lot of licenses out there that aren't really open source. So we talked about how in sort of 98 or so, this term open source was defined as a difference from being free software. And at the same time, they formed the Open Source Initiative to basically maintain the term and maintain a definition of what was an open source license. So we have the OSD that has a whole list of things that a license must be to qualify as an open source license. And obviously there's things in there like you must be able to take the source code and modify it and things like that. Those are the obvious things. But it goes beyond that, and I think one of the most interesting points here is this idea that the license must not restrict other software. So for example, if I want to run a Linux server, Linux is under the GPL v2 license. I can run commercial software on top of that. I can run my own software on top of that. Nothing about the Linux license requires me to do anything with my own software. I'm free to do what I like on top of the Linux server because the license does not restrict that other software. That being said, there are definitely differences between licenses in this regard, and the big difference is between copyleft and permissive licenses. So copyleft licenses, the big one of these is the GPL license, and these are considered viral licenses. And I'm not saying that as a criticism. It is, by definition, they are supposed to be viral because they are supposed to ensure that no one makes derived works of this software and sells it commercially without contributing back their changes. That's really what it is. So a lot of companies will take and customize the Linux kernel, particularly true for sort of little hardware devices or your mobile phone and things like that. But they are required to distribute the source code for their modifications to the Linux kernel because they created derived work. So somewhere that information will be posted and you'll be able to download that source code. And that's a requirement of the GPL license. Some of these other licenses, like the Eclipse and Mozilla public licenses, are somewhat more permissive, but they still have some restrictions. So for example, the Mozilla public license, if you change any of the files that were originally under that license, you have to publish your changes. But if you just create new source code within that same project, you don't have to publish those. On the other side of the fence, we've got these permissive licenses that you'll see on the majority of things like NPM packages, Apache, MIT, and BSD. And they all vary a bit, but essentially they don't have that same requirement around derived works and having to publish them out in the same way. So they're more commonly considered business friendly. And then finally, we've got things that are either completely public domain or the unlicensed, which is the license that's kind of trying not to be a license. And it's really saying, do what you like with this. I don't retain any copyright, but I also, don't come back to me if you have problems with this. So whereas some of these other licenses do have like patent protection and there's sort of communities around maintaining those licenses, and if someone tries to abuse them, they will sort of help you with court cases. So the power of these licenses, kind of ironically, is from copyright law. So while the free software movement in particular might sort of want all software to be free, they're making use of copyright law to enforce their licenses that keep things free. Now, if you're going to be using open source at work, you will often find that companies are afraid of these copyleft licenses, particularly the GPL. And you'll hear edicts to say, no, we can't have anything that's GPL here. Now, ironically, these same organizations probably are running Linux servers, but because that Linux server doesn't require them to be publishing whatever's run on top of it, they're free. It's not causing them any problems. But if you are going to incorporate open source like licensed libraries or frameworks or whatever into what you build at a company, it's important to understand those kind of restrictions that your organization may have about which licenses you're allowed to use. And it's very often overlooked. Because what tends to happen is you're 2 years into a project and someone comes in and says, well, we need to audit the licenses you're using. Oh, and by the way, you can't use this one, or this one. And you may find that the things that are under those licenses you're not allowed to use are at the core of your application and require major rewrites. So you don't want to be in that situation late on. You want to find those problems out soon enough. The same concerns often apply if you're going to contribute something back. So you need to check before you contribute for things that you're doing under your company's time, because fundamentally there's a question about who owns this code. If you wrote it on company time, chances are you don't own it. Your company owns that, and they own the copyright on that code. So you can't just submit it to an open source project without thinking about it. Because often, not always, but often, as part of submitting that code, you have to explicitly hand over the copyright to it so that it can have the copyright of that project. It varies, something like the Linux kernel, every contributor maintains their own copyright, and that's a deliberate decision they made so that they can't relicense Linux from GPL v2 because they'd need to get every single contributor to agree because they all hold the copyright. But projects where they hold the copyright centrally, they do have the ability to change the license for good or for bad, as we'll find. Now, sometimes you'll talk to your manager and say, well, I want to contribute this fix to a project, and they'll tell you we need to talk to the lawyers. Now, this is often a very long-winded way of saying no, but sometimes this fix is important enough that you might actually want to have that conversation or try and convince them, no, we can do this without talking to the lawyers. Well, what it often comes down to is this question of whether you want to maintain this. So let's say you've got a fix to a library that you're using, and this is a bug fix. Your production system doesn't work without this fix. Now, you can easily take a copy of that source code, create your own repo, apply your fix, publish that bundle or whatever into your artifact repository, and use that instead of the version from the internet. And all by virtue of the open source license and the source code being available. But putting aside any concerns about whether that's okay on a licensing point of view, you're now the maintainer of this. So the next time someone makes a change to that original project, perhaps they introduce another bug fix you need, or a feature you really want to use, you now have the problem that you have to merge their changes into your changes, and perhaps they change the same source code, and you have to figure out how it works now. But if you'd contributed that back to the original project, it would have been their problem to merge their changes into your changes, and everything gets a lot easier, and you'll have your fixes automatically incorporated into the next release. So that can be a good argument to your manager to say why you really should be allowed to contribute this back, because it's going to make things easier for the company. If you fail that argument with your manager, you may still want to consider, it's a small change, it's going to take me a couple of hours. Why don't you do it in the evening? Contribute it back. Yes, you're not getting paid for that time, but you may have made your life easier for the next coming 6 months or years or however long you're using this library. Something to consider. And while some companies may actually have contracts where they claim to own everything you do in your own time as well as everything you do in your work time, I'm not sure those are particularly enforceable. Now, commercial or open source is this sort of gray area where we have companies spending a lot of time developing open source projects. And this can be for good or for bad. So if we take something like the Linux kernel, firstly, we have a Linux Foundation, which has all of these corporate sponsors. And the Linux Foundation is not just about the Linux kernel. They do a lot for open source in general. And I believe they're also the parent of the Cloud Native Foundation that we have projects like Kubernetes under. So it's like, you know, a lot of big companies are signed up to this to support it. And it's probably a bit of an eye chart on the right there, but it's basically showing all of the different companies that contributed to the Linux 5.10 kernel. And there's a lot of big companies in there. We've got Intel, AMD, and ARM, and these are all competitors, but they're all collaborating and contributing to the Linux kernel because they've all decided it's in their best interest to work together to have Linux support their latest and greatest chips in the most efficient way. Because if they didn't contribute back, you'd have to go and download a version of Linux from Intel or from AMD or for ARM, depending upon which processor you were going to use, and it would just make everything more difficult. Now, in the kind of gray area side of things, I don't know how many of you you recognize these two icons. Most of you are probably more familiar with the guy on the right. Now, this is Hudson and his offspring, if you like, Jenkins. Now, Hudson was created around 2008 by a developer at Sun Microsystems. Now, as some of you probably remember, Sun was bought by Oracle. And this project and this developer went across to Oracle. And things continued okay for a little while. And I don't know the details of this, but eventually there was some kind of dispute with Oracle around the maintenance of this project. And so they decided to fork the project. Oracle didn't let them continue to use the Hudson name or the Hudson logo, so they renamed it Jenkins and they came up with a new logo. Now, these days, if you get someone's resume, how often do you see Hudson on it? Probably not very often, but you see Jenkins on it all the time because Jenkins is still very actively used. And the reality is, although Oracle tried to keep things going for a while, they eventually contributed to the Eclipse Foundation, and then the Eclipse Foundation realized, well, no one's using this, no one's contributing to it, it doesn't make sense anymore, and they killed the project in 2017. And everyone keeps using Jenkins. This is really actually a good model. It's an example of how the software being open means that we didn't lose this project. Someone was able to take the source code and fork it. And sure, they had to do some things that were a bit of a hassle to rename and change trademarks and logos, but it kept on and it's continued to thrive because they were able to take that source code and because the license allowed them to do that. Now, things can get a bit hairier, and this is something that's an ongoing issue with something called the server-side public license. And this dates to around 2018, when MongoDB decided that they wanted to relicense from a GPL license to this license they created called the server-side public license. And then Elastic, who have Elasticsearch, did something similar shortly afterwards. Now, this can easily be characterized as a battle between David and Goliath, between these companies and between AWS and other cloud vendors, but particularly AWS in Elastic's case. But it's actually a sort of battle between multiple companies, because really what they were saying was we don't want anyone to host this software, to provide this open source software as a service and to profit from it without doing a commercial license with us as a company. Because that's what AWS was certainly doing with Elasticsearch. You could use Elasticsearch in AWS, they would host it, but it was based on the open source version. It was abiding by the license, the Apache license that it was created under, but Elastic didn't like the fact that people were paying AWS to host it instead of paying them. Now, Mongo did submit this server-side public license to the OSI to get it approved as an open source license. The OSI fairly directly rejected it and called it a FOPEN license, basically a false open license, because what the license required people to do is if they're hosting the open source version of these pieces of software, they're required to also provide the source code for everything they use to host that. So if you think about a cloud provider, they're basically saying AWS would have to provide all of the source code for running everything in AWS in order to host Elasticsearch. And clearly, no one's going to agree to those kind of terms. AWS certainly isn't, and these smaller vendors aren't going to either. So it was really a deal breaker, and that's why it wasn't considered an open license. And if you think back to our OSI definition, it's really that idea of the license shouldn't restrict other software, and that's exactly what they're trying to do with this server-side public license. Now, this isn't a great situation, because what AWS ended up doing, and in collaboration with these other companies, was to fork Elasticsearch to create OpenSearch. Obviously, the name's a bit pointed. They did that deliberately. But they're actively developing OpenSearch on the one hand, and Elastic continues to develop Elasticsearch on the other hand. And so we've now got two projects that continue to have development and new features that aren't compatible with each other. And overall, it's a loss for the community. So it's not a cut and dried thing here. So I kind of want to say it's not all a bed of roses, you know. the reality is open source projects are run by humans, they're managed by companies in some cases, they have commercial objectives. There's a bunch of companies who've found over time they thought they could make a business out of the open source model and selling support. But with the advent of cloud services in particular, they found their income streams have dried up. And there's lots of other companies, obviously, Docker trying to charge for Docker Desktop is because their model of making money off, their various Docker Swarm and things like that has dried up. So they need to look at other revenue streams. But an open source project is not a guarantee of future income. It's just the nature of the beast that if you published your code and said other people can fork it and use it, that's the license you agreed to. But not wanting to end on a negative note, I do want to highlight how open source really can change the world. I've got my Firefox t-shirt on here, but if we go back to these CSS standards I mentioned, like about my early story, this is what Internet Explorer 5 did with the so-called ACID2 test. It made a right mess of it. And this is what, starting with Firefox 3 and really any modern browser, a full implementation of the bits of the specification that this was testing, you now got this silly little smiley face. And that's all as a result of someone deciding, we want to implement the specifications, and we're not beholden to trying to sell you on putting ActiveX widgets into your website, which is really what Microsoft was trying to do with Internet Explorer. So that open source community and the development, now obviously we've now got a monopoly almost from Chrome, which I don't think is great. But it's still a much better situation than we used to be in the days of Internet Explorer 5 and Netscape Navigator 4. And with that, really I wanted to see if there are any questions. I'm going to check out the Discord in case there's any from anywhere else. Okay, well, I think we got the audio sorted, so. Okay, if there's no questions, any projects that anyone particularly wants to give a shout out to before we finish up here, like open source projects they really like? Sorry?
Alacrity.
Alacrity? What does that do?
It's a very fast terminal emulator.
Okay, so. Cool, so that's Alacrity, a fast terminal emulator written in Rust. So one to check out. And Rust has been a huge thing. So interestingly, if you're not aware, Rust was kind of a spin-off of the Mozilla project that they wanted to look at a memory-safe language for writing parts of the Mozilla sort of Firefox browser. So they came up with the Rust language, and it's kind of taken off in a big way to the point where AWS in particular is using Rust a lot, to the point where some people are concerned that they're starting to dominate concerns about how the language is developing too much. But there's also talk about putting bits of the Linux kernel written in Rust, and there's some initial support for that. So it's kind of a big deal. And it was really just a spin-off of the development of a browser. So that's kind of cool. So with that, I'll say goodbye, thank you, enjoy the rest of the conference.